Welcome, everyone, to today's Skill Up. My name is Emily Sprenger. I'm an academic learning specialist at NU. I'm joined here by my colleague as well, Jenna Johnson. And so if you see her name in the chat, she is here to assist with questions along the way. And we are honored to have Dr. Linda Bloomberg present today's session. Couple of very brief items to cover in the beginning. We are recording today's session. We will post this skill up in the Graduate Studies Support Center for your review as a resource at a later date. And the scrolling subtitles are available to you. So should you want to enable them, you're welcome to reach out to me in the chat if you need assistance doing so. Dr. Bloomberg is just an excellent resource of rich information when it comes to research here at NU. And we are thrilled that she comes to our sessions to present and share her expertise with us. She has mentioned that we would like you to have a conversation in the chat, but if you have questions, please do pop them in the Q&A and we'll get to that as time permits. I think that's about it, Dr. Bloomberg, from my side of the house. I'm going to move this right on over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Emily and Jenna, for hosting. And as always, to the Graduate Studies Support Center for welcoming me and for providing our students with these resources. Today, we'll be talking about qualitative research terminology. And then again in November, I think it is, Emily, we're going to be doing the quantitative side of the house. So please feel free to join that one as well. And then you'll have a complete picture of the complete research terminology roadmap. So as Emily said, please do post any questions that you have in the chat. I'll be stopping at certain points along the way to answer and respond to questions. And then again, at the end, we'll have a chance to address any questions, comments, or suggestions that come up. So I'm really looking forward to this, and I hope that it's a good learning experience for everybody. I just wanted to make sure that we are all understanding what the objectives of today's webinar are. And these are really to deepen our understanding around many of the terminologies and terms that are used in qualitative research in particular, because there are often conflicting terminology incorporated in books, in journal articles, etc. And so it can be pretty confusing. And there really is no one right term. So what I'm presenting here today is my take on the terminology based on what I've read and what I've studied. But again, this is not set in stone, and your advisor or your department may have a different way of naming something. So we can also talk about that if any of these kind of questions come up along the way. I wanted to present what I have developed as the Qualitative Research Terminology Roadmap, which is a broad picture of the different types of terms that are critical to qualitative research. And we're going to be going through each of them individually, starting with number one, which is research ethics. Now, research ethics is something that is critical to understand right from the very beginning of undertaking a study. And it's also critical to bear this in mind as you move through your study at all the different stages and phases. It's not something that you read about and then forget about. It's something that is in the back of your mind at all times, because it is, it is something that is really central to conducting rigorous and trustworthy research. We're going to talk about the terms rigorous and trustworthy as well. But ethics really underpins everything that we do. And research ethics are based on the principles that are laid out in the Belmont Report. And there are three principles: respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. And these principles are enforced by all IRBs, institutional review boards, whether it's at National University or elsewhere. And just to give you a little tiny bit of background, the Belmont Report was developed based on research studies that in the past were conducted with people unethically. People were made subjects of research, people were not treated with respect in research, people were not aware of what they were being researched for. And so human rights ethics have really moved toward making research transparent, ethical, and respectful for all individuals. And there's a lot written on research ethics, and it really is something to delve into at the start of research, particularly so that you are very, very well aware of what is permitted and what is not permissible. And again, the Belmont Report is the gold standard, the Belmont Report of 1979. So please do take a look at that. So let's look at all of these three principles and really what goes into them. One of the most important ideas is informed consent. And if you think about it, this really applies to all three principles: respect, beneficence, and justice, because informed consent means that the researcher must make the participants aware of everything about the research study, including any potential risks. And any study includes risks, even if these are very, very minimal. And written consent to voluntarily proceed with the study must be received from every single research participant. This is critical, and your IRB proposal, your IRB application will make this very, very clear. You will have to have a consent form, a template of a consent form to present to IRB in your application, and they will scrutinize this very, very carefully to make sure that everything is in place and that all the T's are crossed and all the I's are dotted and that everything is as it should be. Now, in cases where individuals cannot give informed consent, such as people who are underage or have a cognitive impairment, or for whatever other reason cannot provide legal consent, we have what is called assent. And here the guardian or the parent would provide that consent on their behalf. Now, it's also really important to understand what we mean by vulnerable populations. Remember, all of what I'm talking about are the terminology, are the terms that we are talking about here today. So vulnerable populations is a term that you may hear, and you most likely will hear, because these are groups of people who need special sensitivity. This includes children who are, they're not adults, prisoners, individuals with impaired decision-making capacity, economically or educationally disadvantaged individuals, or historically marginalized, underrepresented, or underserved groups. So all of these vulnerable populations need additional care when we do research with them, because they are not able to give informed consent as others may give. So there's no getting around it. The vulnerable populations are groups that really require special care. And in fact, in dissertation research, you're advised not to do research with vulnerable populations, because with these populations, the IRB process is way more stringent, just to safeguard that these people are being treated fairly and with respect. Now, there are three other terms that we're going to talk about here when we talk about research ethics, and these are privacy, anonymity, and confidentiality. So privacy means that researchers must ensure that the research participants' information is private by collecting research anonymously, and that information is then kept confidential. So you can see that privacy, anonymity, and confidentiality are all tied together. Anonymity means, I'm just moving my thing away here. Anonymity means that the study does not include any identifiable information of the individuals participating in your research. This includes their real names, the demographics, their addresses, any other identifying information that would enable a reader of the study to know who these people in your study are is not permitted. So what we do is we give people identifiers, such as pseudonyms, which are made-up names, or we just call them by, participant 1, participant 2, or participant A and participant B, in order not to identify who they are actually. And then confidentiality means that whatever the researcher has gathered has to remain within the researcher's domain. The researcher cannot divulge any information to anybody else. And that is why it's recommended that all the information that you collect in your study is kept in a locked safe or on a hard drive that is password protected, so that no information about the research participants can in any way, shape, or form be made available to anybody else. And in fact, there are rules for how long you have to store the information and then destroy it. This, again, will depend on your specific IRB, and they will let you know what is required. So let's move to the second part of my research terminology roadmap, and that is the role of the researcher. Now, in qualitative research, you're not doing research objectively as you would be doing in quantitative research. And we'll discuss this in the follow-up webinar when we talk about quantitative terminology. In qualitative research, there is a term called researcher as instrument. And this really centers on the researcher's subjectivity. That means the researcher's biases, assumptions, personal feelings that we all come to our research with as human beings. But in contrast to quantitative research, where the researcher tries as hard as possible and has to kind of prove that they're being objective and not allowing any of their own subjectivity to enter, in qualitative research, we acknowledge that as human beings, we all carry subjectivity and we have to just disclose it. So in your research dissertation, you'll talk about your assumptions, your biases, etc., so that everything is very transparent and the reader of your study will know what you bring to your study and what you feel and think and what your assumptions are. Now, another really important term is the term positionality. And this applies to a researcher's role, social location, and their identity, and how they show up in relation to their participants. And I write a lot about this in my current book, which is Completing Your Qualitative Dissertation, a roadmap from beginning to end, and also in the new book that I'm just completing at the moment, which is called 101 Nuggets to Prepare for a Qualitative Dissertation. I write a lot about positionality because this has become a central topic and a central concept in qualitative research. Again, it all means that the researcher has to be very transparent about who they are, what they bring to the study, what they think, and what their biases are. Because we all, as human beings, carry these things. And so through reflexivity, which we're going to get to in a minute, and ongoing critical reflection, the researcher will be very, very transparent about their own positionality. So what is reflexivity? Reflexivity is really a similar term to what we would call critical reflection or reflectivity. And it's really about self-examination, examining ourselves as a researcher and remaining aware of how our own assumptions, biases, and preconceptions can affect any part of the research at any stage of the research process. And again, in terms of positionality, and because we know that we are researcher as instrument, we will be very, very explicit about who we are in the research process, what we bring to the table, and how and in what ways we, as the researcher, may influence the study. Now, remember, because in qualitative research, we are selecting our sample ourselves. It's a small, purposeful sample. It's not like a large, random sample as we would have in quantitative research. So here's a point at which a researcher can be very subjective and choose the people they want and exclude the people they want. So think about it. Think about how much power the researcher has. And this is part of what reflexivity is all about. We have to reflect on what we bring to the process and how and in what ways we may be influencing the process at every single stage. The same goes for data collection. We collect data and we report on that data, but there's nothing hanging over us telling us what to report or how to write up our findings. So again, the researcher's own ways of doing things, biases, preconceptions can creep in. So in order to be reflexive, it's highly recommended that qualitative researchers keep a journal to maintain a clear record of what they've done at every single step of the way, and to be very transparent about all the different decisions they've taken to show in the end that you have really tried to maintain respect for your participants and try to maintain a very, very high level of ethics so that your research can be trusted and considered rigorous and trustworthy. So before we get to research paradigms, which is another whole shift, I'm going to take any questions that may have come up so far, because we've touched on a number of really important ideas here, and somebody or a group of people, anyone, may have some questions right now. So I'm ready to answer these and address them. So please feel free.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bloomberg. And what we'll do, since we have about 70 people on the call, if you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A or in the chat. I do have a question for you, Dr. Bloomberg. You had mentioned risk in the informed consent. Are you able to share an example of risk in informed consent?
Yes, let me just preface, that's a great question. And I just want to take one step back by saying there's always risk. You cannot say in your IRB proposal there's no risk, because even the way you ask somebody a question could be an emotional risk for them. It could be threatening or triggering for them. So that would be like minimal risk. But a higher level of risk could be that somebody participates in your study and they say something, and then somebody reads the study and that person suddenly loses their job. Or, we cannot ever minimize that there can be ramifications of the research, even when a researcher is being very, very careful to maintain confidentiality and anonymity. In some cases, when research is done within a specific small context, as it is in qualitative research, there's always a risk that somebody may recognize something, or somebody may be upset by what someone else says. So we have to just be very, very mindful to keep all these safeguards in place, like anonymity and confidentiality, but at the same time, in the back of our minds, know that we are, somehow in some way maybe putting somebody at risk. And that is why when research participants sign the informed consent form, they're very well aware that they're signing with minimal to no risk, but hopefully there is no risk, or that it's very, very minimal. But that's a great question. And again, there are books written on this. Durdella has an excellent book on IRB applications, and I think it's in the references of my book. And also our IRB will be available to discuss any of these kind of specific questions about the risk posed by any particular study. So that's an excellent question, and I appreciate that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bloomberg. That was the only question that's popped up so far.
Great. Okay, but please feel free to ask any, because this is your chance. So research paradigms, which is our next term. Sorry. Whoops. Okay, so all research, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, is based on a set of philosophical assumptions, which we call a research paradigm. Sometimes it's called a worldview. And the paradigm really is the lens through which the research is conceived, structured, designed, and then executed or conducted. And qualitative research is informed by two specific paradigms. Now, sometimes the paradigms are called research paradigms, and sometimes they're called inquiry paradigms. It really is the same thing. It's just a matter of semantics. So the two paradigms that inform qualitative research, and remember, we'll get to the other paradigms that inform quantitative research in the next webinar that we do in November. But right now, we're just looking at these two paradigms, and they are interpretivism or constructivism. These are just two words for the same paradigm. And the second one is critical theory, which also can be referred to as an advocacy, liberatory, or participatory framework. So the first one, interpretivism or constructivism, here the emphasis is on seeking understanding of the meanings of experience from the viewpoints of your research participants themselves. And the assumption is that reality is socially constructed, and there are multiple realities. My reality is different to somebody else's reality, even in the same experience. So we all create our own reality based on how we view an experience or a situation. And an interpretivist paradigm would be looking for people's understanding of their own experiences. Now, critical theory, which has become a buzzword in qualitative research, and it really has come way more to the forefront than ever before, is really focused on raising awareness of how socially or historically constructed realities have disadvantaged or oppressed certain individuals or groups of people in society. And there are really, the critical theory paradigm has become so prevalent in recent times in all the qualitative research designs, whether it's case study, ethnography, phenomenology, even grounded theory. There is a way bigger emphasis these days because of the realization and because of our acknowledgement that so many individuals and groups have in the past and even recently been oppressed or marginalized. So the critical theory paradigm is extremely important to understand. Both paradigms are. It just depends what your preferred worldview is And so you would then base your study on a paradigm that is really your thought process, your beliefs, and your viewpoints. So critical theory includes feminist ideologies, queer theory, trans theory, critical race theory, disability theory, among others. There are many, many, many types of ways of structuring studies using a critical theory paradigm. So I hope that I've just described it. It's a very complex area, but I've just, within the time available, I've tried to really boil it down to what it is. Okay, let's move to the term research methodology. Now here, there's a lot of confusion in the literature about what this term is. So methodology is really the system of research. And there are two methodologies, actually three. There's qualitative research, there's quantitative research, and there's mixed methods. Those are the three broad buckets of methodologies. And each of them have certain ways of conducting research, thinking about research. For example, qualitative research is very different in its approach to quantitative research. Mixed methods, which brings in aspects of qualitative and quantitative, but remember, it's not just a matter of throwing them together. There are very, very strict guidelines of how to set up a true mixed method study. And just as an aside, mixed methods is not really always recommended for dissertation research, A, because it takes way longer, B, because it requires the researcher to have skill in both qualitative and quantitative methods and designs, and C, because it's just much, much, much more complex, and so really not really very well suited to a dissertation, which one wants to complete within a relatively reasonable amount of time, not many, many years. So these are the three methodologies, and your choice of methodology will shape all of the decisions that are made throughout a study, and I've bolded and underlined that at the end, because that really is the crux of the matter, that everything that you do in your research will hinge on the methodology that you've chosen. And in this case, we're looking at qualitative. So now going one step down from methodologies is the actual research design. And here, again, there's a lot of confusion because some books and some researchers will refer to the designs as methodologies or approaches. So the way that I see it, the design is the way that you are going to structure your study, and it's also based on the philosophy of how you come to your research, which then again goes back to the research paradigm. So if you can sort of see what I'm trying to get at, is that everything is interrelated. Your paradigm, which is the base, sets up what you're going to study, which is your methodology, whether it's qualitative or quantitative. And then going one step up is your research design. So let's look at what are the research designs in qualitative research. These are, for example, case study, narrative inquiry, ethnography, action research, phenomenology, and grounded theory. Those are the main research designs currently in qualitative research. And each of the designs is based on a paradigm that guides your research process. So because you've chosen a qualitative methodology, either your study will be more constructivist or more in a critical theory vein. So you will set that up according to what your research problem is and what you particularly are committed to in terms of what you want the outcomes of your research to be. Do you want your research to be just an exploration of people's understanding of their reality, which is the constructivist/interpretivist strand? Or are you more interested in raising awareness because there's something out there in the world that needs a spotlight on it because it's caused some form of oppression, marginalization? So again, you will choose your research design based on what your understanding is in terms of what the research should achieve. The primary difference among all of these designs, phenomenology, narrative inquiry, ethnography, grounded theory, and action research, lies in their philosophical underpinnings, exactly as I've just explained it. As the researcher, you're going to select an appropriate design to best address your own study's problem, purpose, and research questions. So there has to be a level of alignment, a very high level of alignment, and alignment is one of the terms we're going to talk about in great detail a little further on in this presentation. So if you've understood the logic behind your research design, in other words, what is the philosophical basis of it? How will it address my study's problem, purpose, and research questions? you will then start to get what we call methodological congruence, which is a term that is really very highly spoken about in qualitative research. And it actually also would apply to quantitative research, because it means that there's a level of alignment among the way you think about your study, the way you actually set it up, and then the way that you conduct it. And here we go. Here's alignment right now. So let's take a deeper dive into what it means. In my book, Completing Your Qualitative Dissertation, I actually talk about 12 different points of alignment that one has to take care of in a dissertation. And these 12 things have to be interconnected and interrelated so that your study is a cohesive whole rather than just a sum of fragmented parts. So the whole puzzle will fit together, as opposed to just a number of puzzle pieces lying on the table and not connected yet. Now, there are numerous components that must be aligned. First, your research problem and your research design. That is critical, as I discussed in the previous slide. You won't just choose a research design because you like the sound of it. That research design has to fit with your research problem. So, for example, if you like the idea of grounded theory because you want to develop a theory, but your research problem is not about developing a theory, then it wouldn't make any sense to have a grounded theory design. If you wanted to discuss, if you like the idea of phenomenology, but your study is more appropriate to being a case study because you're not really looking at the lived experiences of a very small number of people, like 2 or 3, and you're not really intending to do multiple in-depth interviews, you rather want to do a series of individual interviews, one-off interviews, then your study would be better suited to a case study design rather than phenomenology. So the point I'm trying to make is that even though we maybe will find certain designs appealing or interesting, it does not mean that that design is the most suitable one for your study. So there has to be this alignment among your design and your research problem. Next, your research problem and the research methodology. Your problem, as you stated, must be appropriate to be a qualitative research study. If you were interested in the cause and effect of 2 variables, you're not going to find that qualitative research is for you. You're going to be much better off choosing a quantitative research approach or research methodology, because that is what variables and experimentation is all about. If you're interested in exploring people's perceptions and understanding their experiences, then qualitative research would be an appropriate methodology. Once you've settled on your design and your methodology, you then have to look at the research methods, which are the ways of collecting data and the ways of analyzing data. And again, these have to be specific to your particular research design, because, for example, grounded theory collects data in a very different way than phenomenology. Phenomenology collects data in a very different way to ethnography or narrative inquiry. So we have to really understand what the design is all about and what it is, the philosophy that it's based on and the methods that it uses in order to determine if that research design is going to be appropriate for our particular study. Then again, your design, your findings, and the data analysis all have to mesh together and have to be aligned. And finally, the way that you interpret the data and analyze the data, again, has to be specific to your particular research design, because phenomenology will analyze and present data very differently to a narrative inquiry study, which tells a story and is focused on a storyline. And again, these are very different to grounded theory, which has as its end goal developing a theory. So as you can see, alignment is something that you have to be aware of right at the very start. And then throughout your study, you have to check yourself that everything that you're doing is aligned with your chosen research design. And again, at the completion stage, you'll revisit the importance of alignment. So alignment is really something that contributes to a high quality dissertation. And if it's not evident, the study really doesn't carry much weight. There would be a lot of questions about the integrity of the study if alignment was not evident. And if it actually got to the stage of a dissertation defense, it would definitely be questioned, and you would be asked to explain why certain components do not seem well aligned. And that wouldn't be something that you want to do. So taking care of alignment right from the start is critical. And alignment affords the study what I said earlier is as methodological congruence. This is a term that was developed by Richards in 2020. And methodological congruence ensures what I call, and write about in my book, methodological integrity. And as I said, in my book, I identify 12 different points of alignment that must be ensured in qualitative research. We've just discussed here, the ones that I have over here are just the important ones in setting up your study, but there are others as well in terms of like your theoretical framework, your literature review, the way that you present the findings, etc. So again, we've covered quite a lot here, and alignment is a really important concept. So I'm going to stop and ask Jenna or Emily if there are any questions that I would be very happy to address and then move on.
Yes, thank you so much. We did have another question come up in the Q&A, and as we're going over this, if something else comes up, please feel free to put it in the chat or the Q&A. We can always come back to it at a later time. So one of the questions has to do with content analysis. And the question is, do you see content analysis as a mixed method?
Okay, content analysis is actually a quantitative method, and it can be used in mixed methods because you're using qualitative and quantitative methods in your study. But in qualitative research, we typically do what's called thematic analysis. Content analysis strictly is about counting, and qualitative research is not about numbers and figures and percentages. So content analysis is more quantitative, but it does come into play in a mixed method study. There are certain recent developments in content analysis that can be more on the qualitative side, but again, it's not a matter of counting like in traditional content analysis. It's more, it fits more in the field of discourse analysis, where we look at understanding people's dialogue. And that's another whole area. I've written about that in my book, but there's too much to go into in this actual presentation. But yes, take a look at what's called discourse analysis if you're interested in content analysis as it applies to qualitative research.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bloomberg. I think that's it for the moment.
Okay. So let's move on then to what the research sample is in qualitative research. And the terms to understand are research sample and target population. Your research sample is a subset of the target population. So for example, if you're studying students in a particular university, your sample would be a set of those students that you select purposefully. So the way that we select a sample in qualitative research is called purposeful sampling, and sometimes referred to as purposive sampling. It's the same thing. And purposeful means just that we are being very, very purposeful about who we are going to have in our study, because we want a sample that is very rich in information, because it's, as opposed to quantitative research, we're not looking at this huge random sample that can sometimes be hundreds or even thousands of people. We're looking at a small sample, which is typically between 10 and 20 people, typically, but it can be smaller, it can be a little larger. And so we have to develop a strategy for choosing the people that we want in our study. And there are many different purposeful sampling strategies, such as criterion-based sampling, which we use in phenomenology, theoretical-based sampling, which we would use in a grounded theory study, maximum variation sampling, which we would use in case study, etc. So again, I'm just touching on all of these terms now because the focus of this presentation is terminology. But please do take a deeper dive into all of these different strategies and select the one for your study that fits best with your research design. So for example, you would not choose theoretical sampling if you're doing a case study or phenomenology. You'd only choose theoretical sampling if you're doing a grounded theory study. And maximum variation applies specifically to case study, because you want a sample that has a broad representation of people, even though it's a small sample. You don't want everybody to be exactly the same. You want to look at a slightly diverse group. Whereas with phenomenology, you're looking at the essence of experience of a smaller, even smaller than case study group of people. It could even be 3 people. But there you're looking at criterion-based sampling rather than maximum variation. So what I'm trying to drive home is that it's really important to understand the different sampling techniques that make up purposeful sampling, and to choose the one that best fits with your research design. Now, sample size is a term that comes up again and again. And as I was saying, Qualitative research has no exact sample size. We do want to reach what's called saturation, and that term also comes up, but there's no specific magic formula in qualitative research to determine that saturation has for sure been reached, and there's no specific magic formula to say that a particular sample size is the right way to go or the right sample size. There is no one right way. So again, it depends on your research question, your particular study, your research design, that'll then help you determine what an adequate sample size should be. Let's now move to the term methods. Now, we know from what I've just discussed about methodology that methods is not the same as methodology. Methodology, as we said a few minutes ago, is the whole group of techniques and procedures that make up a research approach. And this would be qualitative research, quantitative research, or mixed methods. So that's methodology. Methods, in contrast, are the specific ways that you collect data, select samples. Well, select sample would go first, then collect data, and then analyze and present your data. So those are the data collection methods. And again, there has to be what I said earlier, methodological congruence and methodological integrity for your overall study to be considered trustworthy and ethical. Primary research is another term. Primary research involves collecting data from directly engaging with your research participants. You do interviews, you conduct focus groups, you're sitting with people, you're talking to them, you've developed these instruments yourself, you've developed the interview questions, you're not going to get your exact interview from anyone else, you have to develop it based on your own particular study and your own particular research problem. And so you're engaging firsthand with your research participants. You're meeting the people in person, on the phone, by Zoom, whatever, but you're actually having contact with people. This is very different to quantitative research, which can be conducted in a laboratory or even very impersonally. But qualitative research is very personal because you're looking at people's perceptions of their experiences and you're engaging with them one-on-one. Secondary research involves using data that has already been collected, and this can be called archival data. This is where you are not doing research with individuals, but you're doing research with material that's already been collected. This can be documents, it can be records, it can be artifacts, it can be newspapers, journals. But typically in dissertation research, we are doing primary research with human participants. Now, remember, secondary research also has ethical implications. You also have to follow ethical rules because even though people are not involved primarily, someone has written the document, someone has written that journal article, someone has created an artifact. And so that artifact also carries implications. And so we have to treat these with respect. We have to treat them with confidentiality and anonymity. So again, the three principles that are mentioned in the Belmont report will come into play with secondary research as well. So now let's just take a deeper dive into data collection methods. We've already spoken about sampling methods, which is the purposeful sampling and the different types of ways that we can go about this, like criterion-based, maximum variation, theoretical sampling, etc. Let's look at the methods of data collection in qualitative research. And it's important to know that interviews are generally the primary method of data collection because these have the potential to elicit really rich data, which is what we're looking for. So I'm not saying that interviews have to be the only method, and we'll look at triangulation in a moment because there is no one method that's used. We always use at least two methods, but interviews are usually one of the two or one of the three or four because of the benefits that they bring. Other methods to include are focus groups, which are group interviews, open-ended questionnaires. We do not call them surveys in qualitative research. We refer to questionnaires, observation, document review, which is a form of secondary research because they're looking at documents that have already been produced, and then critical incident questionnaires, which I really love. Critical incident questionnaires were developed by Flanagan in 1954, and they really are an excellent way to gather data from people in a very unobtrusive way and to get at very, very, very rich data because we only ask two questions in a critical incident questionnaire. We ask about the high and the low point of an experience, or the positive and the negative, or the strengths and the limitations. So we're really just looking at 2 points, high and low. and asking people to reflect on these and tell us about it. Now, triangulation is an important, very important, and Emily, I see you've just popped up, but I'm just going to finish triangulation and then I'm going to open it up because I have a feeling there are some questions. But triangulation means that we have to collect data by more than one method alone. This refers to qualitative research because we combine several data collection methods to make sure that we're not just getting data from one source. Triangulation is really important to address the trustworthiness of the study. And the underlying rationale is to mitigate the weakness of any one method. Now, remember, there are other forms of triangulation as well. This is what we call method triangulation. There's also data source triangulation, where we look at different groups of people in a study or different individuals, again, to get a much broader view of the phenomenon that we're studying. So methods triangulation is specifically about combining at least two and hopefully more methods so that you're really gathering rich data in different ways, so that you really can walk away from your study and know that you haven't left any stone unturned and that you've really tried to look at everything with an open mind and in different ways. Okay, I'm going to stop there for a moment. And I'm also just watching the time and I know how much time we have left.
We're doing pretty good. We've got about 16 more minutes until the top of the hour. Thanks for pausing, and then we'll see based off of how long these questions take if we should just continue to the end. Someone had asked in the Q&A, can you use both primary and secondary methods?
Yeah, because secondary methods are really document review, and document review is one of the ways of using a method of data collection in your study. So if you're looking at an organization, for instance, a great strategy is to do interviews or focus groups or both of those, and then also document review. So you're reviewing that organization's documents, their meeting minutes, their handbooks, their annual reviews, etc., so that you're getting a really good idea of what that organization is based on. But remember, documents, any document is not an objective piece of information. Any document was written by a human being. Could even be these days written by AI. And even if it's written by AI, it's not unbiased. In fact, a lot of AI material is highly biased because it's coming from a particular source. And that's something to be very, very aware of in AI materials that we use in our academic work. But yes, one can use, the long story is, the short answer is, yes, you can use primary and secondary.
Thank you so
Any
much,
other
Dr.
questions?
Bloomberg. Yes. Couple of questions about the interviews. I know you touched on this earlier. Someone was wondering if when they do their interviews in their doctoral research, do they have a choice of leaving some interviews out of their research?
I'm not going to go too much into that just because we are focused on terminology here, but no, you cannot leave anything out. Everything has to be reported. Once you've asked people respectfully to share their experiences with you, you cannot decide to leave out chunks.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for answering that. And then someone had also asked about Qualtrics, so I will go ahead and put the link in the chat about access to that as NU students for
but that is more
qualitative and quantitative. Yeah.
But you wouldn't really...
you could make a questionnaire in there with open-ended questions, correct? Through Qualtrics?
You could, but the point of qualitative research is to really immerse yourself in the data and to really understand what your participants are telling you. So when you analyze an open-ended questionnaire, it really doesn't behoove you to use a method like Qualtrics or a software application, because you want to read what your participants are telling you, and you're going to have to look for themes, and you're going to have to interpret it. And no application, Qualtrics or others, can actually interpret your data. You are going to have to do that. So even though we can use data analysis software for coding, Qualtrics is not really suitable for qualitative analysis.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bloomberg. We'll pause there.
Okay. Right, so now let's look at methods of data analysis. And this kind of follows really well on from this, because we're going to be coding, which is a system of classification. We're then going to be grouping similar codes into categories. We're then going to be naming those categories and calling them themes. Thematic analysis is all of this. It's about coding, categorizing, and then developing themes. And remember, themes do not just emerge. Sometimes students will say, such and such theme emerged. Themes don't emerge. As a qualitative researcher, you have to actively create, identify, and then create, name a theme. It's not going to just come up. So that's all about thematic analysis. And thematic analysis, there are books written on it. I also have chapters written on it in my book, but it's a very intricate process of data analysis that has to be followed specifically according to guidelines in order for your research to be considered trustworthy. There are some older references to certain researchers that spoke about like 6 steps. And they've since revised their approach because it's not just about following 6 steps and knowing that you've analyzed your data. There's a lot of reflection that goes into qualitative data analysis and specifically thematic analysis. And that reflexivity on the part of the researcher is always there. The researcher is always thinking about what is the meaning underneath these themes? What are people telling me? And not just on a surface level, but what's really going on underneath what they're saying. And that's what qualitative research is about. It's digging down deeper. It's drilling down into the very, very meaning of the findings. Data saturation, I touched on in a couple of slides before, and that's the point at which no new information is coming up. But again, there's no magic formula to know that saturation has occurred. The researcher makes that determination. And it really occurs, you can kind of be comfortable that you have achieved saturation when you're developing themes and the same themes keep on coming up and no new themes seem to be around. You cannot really come up with any new or identify any new themes. And that's when you know that you've saturated the data and that you've probably covered all the themes that are there. And then remember, interpretation is very different to analysis. Analysis is about coding, developing themes, and that's the analytic process. Interpretation is deciding on and trying to understand what is the meaning behind these findings. So this is where you as the researcher shift from being an objective reporter. You can be as objective as you want when you're coding the data, but then you become very subjective when you start becoming an interpreter, because now you're trying to bring in your own experience, what you've read, what you've heard, what you believe in, to try and help you understand what your participants are actually telling you. So interpretation and analysis are interrelated, but different. Rigor and trustworthiness. So rigor means that your study is considered tight, that you've conducted it ethically, responsibly, and according to all qualitative research guidelines. You haven't cut corners. You followed all the data collection procedures as required. You've followed all the data analysis procedures as required, and that you've reached conclusions that seem feasible. That's what rigor is. And rigor is hugely important, both in qualitative and quantitative research. But then qualitative research has a different term that comes up and really must be understood well, because this term replaces what we know from quantitative research to be reliability and validity. I'm going to talk about those terms in the next webinar, but qualitative research is not about reliability and validity at all. The qualitative trustworthiness criteria, of which there are 4, replace reliability, validity, and generalizability, those 3. And what we have are credibility, dependability, confirmability, and transferability. And these are the 4 criteria of trustworthiness for any qualitative study. And there are numerous strategies for achieving each of these 4 criteria. And there's a lot of research, and I've written a lot about this as well. And transparency is a hallmark of rigorous and trustworthiness in qualitative research. Transparency being that you as the researcher, as instrument, are being as transparent, open as possible, so that anybody who's reading your research will understand exactly what you brought to the table, how you conducted the research, what was your positionality in the research process. Remember, we spoke about positionality right at the very beginning, so that your research can be considered trustworthy. And as I said, there are many, many strategies, including triangulation of methods, that contribute to showing and demonstrating that your study is trustworthy. Whoops. I think we've actually come to the end. So that actually gives us at least 7 minutes or so. These are the references. And we have 7 minutes to discuss any questions or issues or concerns that may have come up. So I hope I've covered all the main terms that people may have been thinking about in considering, or in fact, currently conducting a qualitative study. And I'm happy to take from Emily whatever has come up in the chat.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bloomberg. One follow-up question on the questionnaire platform to build open-ended questions for qualitative research. Someone had mentioned, if Qualtrics or other software should not be used to create a questionnaire, how should one create a questionnaire? And I think there was maybe a misunderstanding potentially.
Yeah. Well, Qualtrics is not about creating it. You have to create that questionnaire yourself. As a human,
Yes.
you have to actually write out your questions, which are open-ended, which means that they will not elicit yes, no answers. So in other words, you would not say to somebody in your questionnaire, do you like dogs? Because that would just be a yes, no question. Yes, I like dogs. No, I don't like dogs. You would say, can you tell me about your experience with dogs? Or can you tell me a little bit about what you feel about dogs? That would give the participant an opportunity to respond about what they actually think about dogs. And you wouldn't have that yes, no. Now, the yes, no would be appropriate for quantitative research because there you're just looking at, you want to know what percentage of people said yes and what percentage of people said no, they don't like dogs. You're not really interested in their perceptions, and that's the difference. So you would not use Qualtrics to create a questionnaire. You have to do this yourself based on your research questions. Same as an interview. Your interview questions or your questionnaire questions are based on your study's research questions. They're not the same as a research question, but you should be developing a matrix of research questions and interview questions, or research questions and questionnaire items. And that'll help you align your questions in your data collection method or instrument with your research questions. Again, can you see how alignment is across the board? Everything has to be structured so that nothing is sort of like not in sync. And if you're careful about alignment, everything that you're setting up will then be reflected in your findings, which are then discussed in terms of the research questions, but you're actually looking at your interview responses and then bringing them back to your research questions. And if you've set them up according to research questions to begin with, you'll have a much easier time of aligning your responses with the research questions, which is what's required in a findings chapter or section.
Thank you so much. So I think Dr. Bloomberg's point is you will be developing your questionnaire questions, and Qualtrics is a software system. Once that has been developed and designed with the open-ended, if you're going the qualitative route, that is something that our NU students have used to create their questionnaire.
You can use that if you want. You can use something like SurveyMonkey. But again, my preferred way of analyzing qualitative data, especially in terms of the interviews and the questionnaires, is to really do that manual analysis of coding, developing themes, and then knowing what your data actually speaks to, like what voices are coming through. No application or software can really do that level for you. So you can use the software to a certain point, but then you have to also act like a human being and put yourself out there and think about it more deeply.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for that clarification. Dr. Bloomberg, there were several questions that were specific to students' own research, different research designs and methods that they are using. And I feel in the past, it's best if we've had those questions in the past that maybe the first place to start is with the chair, just because they're more involved with the research process. So I noticed that there was several that came up in the chat, and I appreciate people sharing that. But that would be my recommendation.
I agree with you, Emily, and I appreciate that because we're only looking at terminology here, and because also we are time constrained, and also because the chair is the best person who knows the student's study and how it's set up and what the research problem and everything is. it is best to discuss with your chair. And the chair, that's what your chairs are here for. They really want to understand and help you and support you to develop your study appropriately and well. So please do reach out to your chair for all of that.
Thank you so much. And I did have a couple of questions about your book. And just so everyone in the room knows, I was just talking to Dr. Bloomberg about it and how it doesn't go far from me. So if it would be all right, Dr. Bloomberg, I'll include that as a follow-up for a resource in my email that I send out to the registrants, if that's all right.
Sure, and it's also included in the reference list of this presentation. But yes, please do send, and for whoever's in their qualitative process, my new book is really going to be very helpful because it's based on 101 nuggets to think about doing a qualitative dissertation. And it's very different than a chapter approach like this current book. It's 101 mini essays on all the different aspects of setting up, conducting, thinking about, aligning, et cetera, and then finally evaluating the quality of your qualitative dissertation.
Dr. Bloomberg, I know we only have just a minute left in today's session before we wrap up. I was hoping maybe you could briefly touch on some resources about triangulation before we close out.
I have that in my book. There are other qualitative researchers that have written about it, many, in fact. As I say, there are a number of different ways of triangulating. There's data triangulation, methods triangulation, source triangulation. Triangulation really means bringing together multiple perspectives to mitigate the danger of only doing research in one way, or only having one group of people, or only having one way of looking at things. So it really is, again, broadening the perspective, which is what qualitative research is all about, really trying to understand the depth and the breadth of our participants' experiences that they so graciously share with us.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bloomberg. I do want to thank all of the participants, your questions, your thoughtfulness, and sharing your ideas or needs as NU students as you're pursuing your research. Dr. Bloomberg, as always, thank you so much. And in my follow-up email, I am going to include the registration link for the quantitative session in case you are looking forward to joining us for that one as well. And until the next time.
And this is the date of the quantitative. It's the 4th of November.
Yes, indeed.
I just also want to say thank you to everybody who took the time to join. And thank you so much to Emily and Jenna and the ASL interpreters who are here to support us and to make these resources and these experiences the best possible for our students, that they can really have a positive learning experience, which I hope this was.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bloomberg. And I hope everyone has a great rest of their evening, wherever you are. And until the next time, take care.
Bye, everybody. Bye.
Yeah.